Hey everybody, Pastor Steve. It's time for session number 4 of our Ruth Bible study, Gleaning God in the Everyday. Together we have been retelling the story of Ruth through these sessions. We have said over and over again that Ruth is the entire story of the Bible in 4 chapters and 3 characters. In the story of Ruth, in the midst of those chapters, is the unfolding love story between Ruth and Boaz. The way this story is told would have stood out to an ancient Israelite, but it's probably lost on a lot of today's average readers. As we explore this part of the story, we're going to encounter some parts of it. There are some tough scenes and some things that are hard to read and even harder to understand. And the truth is that if these stories were on the Netflix series that we were streaming, we would probably grimace, look away, and change the channel. Yet these moments are right here in the midst of a very important little biblical story, the story of Ruth. So as you read your Bible, you're often going to find a few parts that we read and we read again, and we really like them. They really make us feel good. Things like, "Come to me, all ye who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Put my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble, and you will find rest for yourselves. My yoke is easy to bear, and my burden is light." We like passages like this, and those are easy for us to grab onto because they provide us some ease and some comfort in the midst of all of life. But you're also going to find some parts of the Bible that can confuse you and sadden you and maybe even anger you, such as moments that will make you just kind of turn away and change the channel. There's some Old Testament stories that just, they work better as children's stories and decorations for your nursery. And even Jesus in the New Testament has a fair amount of jarring stories, just as he has some comforting things to say. So if you read your Bible, you're sometimes going to find moments where you're confused or disoriented. You're unsure how to reconcile different events and statements with another one. Or how to align certain biblical moments with the powerful image it presents of Jesus as a humble God who wins through love. So what do you do when you get to a part of the Bible that you just don't like? Well, we have a couple of options, a lot of things we do. First thing we do is we edit it. We kind of change the meaning of, if we modernize this and look at it from a more modern point of view, and this is not really what they were saying. They were saying it this way, so we edit it a little bit. Or we just ignore it altogether. That's another option. We just kind of ignore it and say, that really isn't applicable for today. Sometimes we just pretend we didn't read that. Well, I'm just not going to read that. I'm going to read this other thing. Thomas Jefferson was said to famously have ripped parts of the Bible out that he just didn't like and ended up with a very thin Bible that he felt was agreeable to his way of thinking. Sometimes we kind of pretend we don't read the things that are difficult for us to read. We also can make some choices about this. We can choose to live like Jesus probably didn't mean it, or we can magnify other events as opposed to these. One of the other things we do is we redefine it. The temptation is to kind of redefine the whole biblical story by the moments that we really like and think, well, that has to say this because it says this other places. And that's helpful at some points, but it also provides challenges for us. The truth is that none of these options will really give us what we want and will get us anywhere closer to the truth. So what are we supposed to do? What are you supposed to do with the inevitable biblical moment when you're confused, you're grimacing, and you're looking away, or at least scratching your head? Ruth chapter 3, our text for this session today, schools us in what to do with those parts of the Bible that we just don't like or understand, don't recognize God in, or all of the above. What we're told to do is you just stick with the story. You stick with the story. Ruth 1 sets the scene of the story by introducing the first 2 main characters and the tragedy in their lives of losing their husbands. Ruth 2 begins to make connections to the effort of those characters and introduces us to our third main character, Boaz. In last session, we examined Ruth's loyal manual labor and Boaz's generous concern as an illustration of how God partners in our everyday lives to renew the world. Well, in this session, we'll explore Ruth and Boaz's hidden fidelity as a way to begin to understand how God partners with even the small seemingly insignificant choices that we make, ultimately leading to a significant impact on the entire world. So let's look at the first scene in our session for today. Scene number 1, we're going to call it Naomi's scheme. Although even calling it that provides us a little bit of a challenge because it's really not a scheme. It's not. It's how we read it. It's how we often interpret it. But it really is something more than just that. So let me read to you from Ruth chapter 3, the beginning of that. Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, "My daughter, shouldn't I seek security for you so that things might go well for you? Now, isn't Boaz, whose young women you were with, our relative? Tonight he will be winnowing barley at the threshing floor. You should bathe, put on some perfume, and wear nice clothes, and then go down to the threshing floor. Don't make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. When he lies down, notice the place where he's lying, then go uncover his feet and lie down. He will tell you what to do." Ruth replied to her, "I will do everything you are telling me." So Naomi kind of gets straight to the point here. Ruth has been working in Boaz's field, and now Naomi is about to give her a little push in that direction. You seem to be getting more and more interested and close to this guy Boaz, and he has a unique ability to redeem us. Quick review from last week is that a redeemer in ancient Israel isn't just an abstract kind of a spiritual idea, but a very real relational concept. Here's the gist. A redeemer, also known as a guardian redeemer, is a close relative who has the responsibility to purchase back or restore something that has been lost by a family member. So if a family member loses their land, which is the equivalent to losing one's financial independence, you take them in and you provide for them and restore them to their land. In other words, you buy back their protection and their provision. You would be called their redeemer. In the ancient world, Elimelech, Naomi's husband, probably was a landowner, and when they fled to Moab, he sold off his property. Naomi, being a widow, didn't have the ability to be able to restore herself to the land. She has no authority to do that as she returns to her home. However, if she can persuade a blood relative to repurchase the land at his own cost and without any real benefit to himself, then he will also take on the responsibility of caring for the widows on that land, or Naomi and Ruth. This would give him more land to work with, but also more people to feed. Interesting in this story is Boaz. Boaz is both a family member and a landowner. That positions him uniquely to be able to redeem this couple, these women. But he also appears to be a man of noble character, which might actually give him motivation to even do something like this, to truly redeem these two widows. He would accomplish it by marrying Ruth and taking Naomi into his family, sheltering them under the protection of his wings and providing for them. So we pick up the story from there. Boaz, is going to be in the threshing floor, and so she says, you should bathe, put on some perfume, wear nice clothes, and then go down to the threshing floor. Don't make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking, and when he does, notice the place where he's lying. Then go and cover his feet and lie down, and he will tell you what to do. Ruth replied to her, I'll do everything you are telling me. So she went down to the threshing floor, and she did everything just as her mother-in-law had ordered. So we're here at this story at the end of the barley harvest. It's a high celebratory time in the life of this culture. Boaz and his team have been working hard. They've enjoyed a big payday, and now it's time to party. After the barley harvest has been collected, so tonight it's customary that on that night that Boaz would throw a little feast at his place for all of his workers. Naomi points out that Boaz is going to have a drink or two at the part of the celebration. And then sure enough, we're told a few verses later, Boaz ate and drank, and he was in a grand mood. He went over to lie down by the edge of the grain pile. In Hebrew, it says he drank until his heart was tov. Tov, T-O-V, is the Hebrew word meaning good, cheerful, and merry. He ate and drank, and he was happy. He was in a good mood. He was having a good time at this party. So then let's return to verse 3. Naomi instructs Ruth, bathe, put on some perfume, wear nice clothes, and then go down to the threshing floor. So you may be asking when you read this, as a modern reader, is Naomi really kind of manipulating her daughter-in-law here? Is she telling her, more or less, to get all dolled up and offer herself to Boaz after he's drunk? Bathe, put on some perfume, wear nice clothes, and then go down to the threshing floor. Well, that's how the CEB that we've been working at, the Contemporary English, Common English Bible, works at it as we talk about that. But it sounds kind of like Naomi is telling Ruth to get all cleaned up, dressed up, and make a move. But that's really not what's going on here. The ESV version of the Bible does a better job where it translates it this way. Wash, therefore, and anoint yourself, and put on your cloak, and go down to the threshing floor. But the question still stands. What's the instruction here? Is Naomi really manipulating Ruth? Not at all, really. And the reason we know this is because this story links back to one of the worst moments in Israel's story of its greatest hero, David. You probably know the story of David and Bathsheba. King David, feeling lonely and bored while his troops are off on the battlefield, walks up on the balcony of his palace and looks down over his kingdom and notices this beautiful Bathsheba taking a bath on the rooftop. He then uses his kingly power to summon her, a power that almost certainly he used to also get her to sleep with him. He then leverages his influence to try to hide the consequences of those actions. The story tells us that she becomes pregnant, so after failing to manipulate her husband into coming back and to sleep with his wife so that no one could tell whose baby it was, he has her husband killed, so that he can take her as his wife. For a long time, it seems like all this has worked, and his sexual misconduct has been hidden away, allowing him to keep his public image while concealing his private scandal. Sounds like a politician, doesn't it? But then he faces his prophet Nathan, and Nathan points out that he knows what has gone on. He knows what David has done. In response to that, David repents. He feels sorry for what he's done. What happens next is that they lose the baby, and with all that happening, David falls into a state of deep grief. He puts on sackcloth and ashes, traditional garments of mourning. He refuses to eat, he weeps, he lies on the ground, overwhelmed with sadness. So in 2 Samuel 12, we read this in verse 20. Then David rose from the ground, bathed, anointed himself, and changed his clothes. He entered the Lord's house and bowed down. Then he entered his own house. He requested food which was brought to him, and he ate. He washed, he anointed himself, and he changed his clothes. That's what David did after he repented and grieved, when it was time to wash himself of the shame of his own failure, the grief of the death of his unborn child, and to trust God again in spite of it all. He washed, he anointed himself, and he changed his clothes. Or he bathed, he put on some perfume, and he wore nice clothes. That's what Naomi is really telling Ruth to do after she has mourned for a period the loss of Naomi's son, her husband, Ruth's husband, for quite some time. In that culture, a widow would wear some mourning garments, sort of like maybe people wear black to a funeral today. Just like David did, he wore sackcloth and ashes. Those garments were an outward and visible sign that she was unavailable, that she was in a state of grief, and she wasn't looking for a date. So Ruth, even when she's been out gleaning in Boaz's field, has been presenting herself publicly as a widow in mourning, meaning she's not available. So when Naomi says to her these words, bathe, put on some perfume, and change your clothes, she's encouraging her to move past that period of grief and make herself available again. It's really a compassionate mother-in-law who says, Ruth, you've grieved my son long enough. It's time for you to move in another direction. It's time for you to move past this grief. You can find another man. This is not a manipulative mother-in-law convincing her to offer her body to Boaz. It's that compassionate mother-in-law offering Ruth the chance to trust that her story isn't over and that God has not forgotten her. So in the opening verses of Ruth 3, a story from the larger story of God's people that involves some sexual infidelity, leading us to the loss of a husband and a child, the story of a woman victimized by a king who had power over him, manipulated by a man with a power over her. It's important to keep in mind that when Naomi says you should bathe, put on some perfume, wear nice clothes, and then go down to the threshing floor, did not make herself known to the man until they finished eating and drinking. And when he lies down, notice the place where he's lying, and go and cover his feet and lie down, and he will tell you what to do. The other thing that's interesting about this part of the story is that there are clues all over this verse that links us back to another biblical story, a story from Genesis chapter 38. The David and Bathsheba story is in the future. This story is in the past. This is the story of Judah and Tamar. In Genesis 38, Judah leaves Israel to go to Moab. He has 3 sons, Onan, and Shelah. The oldest, marries Tamar, who, like Ruth, is a Moabite woman. Like Ruth's husband, then dies tragically, leaving her widowed. So Judah tells Onan to fulfill his brotherly duty to marry Tamar and have a son with her. Now, this story is going to make not a lot of sense to us, but we need to remember that it's not our part of our tradition. But in those days, it was perfectly understanding that what Judah meant when he said to fulfill your brotherly duty was what Deuteronomy 25 tells them, is that if a brother dies, a younger brother is supposed to marry the widow and be able to have a son so that his name is carried on. I've told you before that my middle name is Briggs. My son's middle name is Briggs. That name comes from my family. My dad's mom's maiden name was Briggs, but there were no more male heirs to carry on that name, so I was given that name, and my son was given that name as a way of carrying on that family tradition. We do that with names now, but in that day it was done when a brother had a child with his brother's widow, then he carried on that brother's legacy. It was his brotherly duty, and so he does this, and we have to talk about this, and so that's one of the things that happened. You may recognize that this from the life of Jesus also. This is probably where the subject of the hypothetical Sadducees question about what happens if a brother marries, 7 brothers marry a widow and no one has a son. Whose wife is she in heaven? That's part comes from this story in Deuteronomy 25. So the best way to honor the life of someone you love, both for a widow and the brother, was to have a son, a living legacy, to record the person who was lost. So Onan marries Tamar, but then Onan obviously also dies tragically young. This story is kind of a tragic story, just like the beginning of Ruth. Now, at the time of the story happens, it says that Judah has 3 sons, and the youngest is Shelah. Shelah, at this point, is just a little boy. He's going to need a few years to grow up before he's ready to marry Tamar and honor his brother's life. But Judah begins to think that marrying Tamar must be a curse. She married my 2 older sons, and they died without having children. So he fears if she marries Shelah, his youngest son, he would die, leaving him with no sons remaining. So he makes other plans for her not to marry his son, but to keep her hostage, locked away to prevent the curse. This is the stuff like our fairy tales are made of. These stories are all over the place. So here's Tamar, held up at her old man's place and held hostage by a collision of kind of 3 forces, an ancient law, a family, a name, and a fear-driven father-in-law. And despite that situation, and in that midst of that desperate situation, Tamar takes some desperate measures. So read the story of Tamar on from there, and it says, after a long time, Judah's wife, the daughter of Shua, died. Then after a period of mourning, probably wearing the mourning clothes and doing all the things that you do, he and his neighbor Hirah, the Edulamite, went up to Timnah, to those who were shearing his sheep. Tamar was told, "Your father-in-law is now on his way up to Timnah to shear his sheep." So Tamar took off her clothing she wore as a widow, covered herself with a veil, put on makeup, and went down to the entrance of Anim, the road to Timnah. She realized that although Shua had already grown up, he hadn't been given to her she hadn't been given to him as his wife. Judah saw her and thought she was a prostitute because she had covered her face. He turned to her beside the road and said, "Let me sleep with you," because he didn't know she was his daughter-in-law. This story kind of starts to make us nervous a little bit because it's a little odd. Some things happen here. So she says to him, "Well, what will you give me for sleeping with you?" And he said, "I will give you a kid from my flock, a goat from my flock." She said, "Okay, but you have to give me a deposit as security to guarantee that you're going to send that back to me." Well, he said, "What kind of deposit do you want?" And she said, "Your seal, its cord, and the staff in your hand." So he gave them to her. He slept with his daughter-in-law, and she became pregnant by him. Again, this story is one of those things where we kind of wince, turn away, and we might even change the channel if this was on our Netflix series. So she disguises herself as a prostitute, waits until Judah passes by. He pulls over, as she expected him to do, and he pays her a way to sleep with him. The story goes on that about 3 months later, Judah was told, "Your daughter-in-law, Tamar, has become a prostitute and is now pregnant because of it." And Judah said, "Bring her out so that she may be burned. I knew this one was trouble. We're going to take care of this once and for all." But when she was brought out, she sent a message to her father-in-law, "I'm pregnant by the man who owns these things. See if you recognize them, whose seal and cord and staff these are." Well, of course, Judah recognized them because they were his. And he said, "She's more righteous than I am because I didn't allow her to marry my son Shelah." And Judah never knew her intimately again. Well, at least that, right? At least that part of the story. So Judah was then the father-in-law of her daughter-in-law's twin sons, Perez and Zerah, and those names become important to the larger story of the biblical narrative. This is both a part of Tamar's master plan to free herself from a tough situation by following the law, extending the family line, and by exposing her father-in-law for the fear and all the things he was. It also represents a complex, grotesque, and uncomfortable moment in the biblical story. It makes you want to change the channel. This means that the bloodline of Israel, like the great-great-great-grandfather of Boaz, the people in the story we're reading, and the chosen ones that God promises to walk closely with, are all part of this same kind of story. And the bloodline goes on and carries on and is the bloodline of Jesus as well. The promised seed of a woman who will renew all things and runs through an ancient, borderline incestuous sex for pay kind of scheme. And we've got that story in the book of Genesis, right? Alongside the faith of Abraham and Sarah, the model of Father Jacob, and the resilient life of a guy like Joseph. Again, if you read the Bible closely, you're going to have the courage to open it up and take in the story as it's written. You're going to find parts that you're just not going to like. And you're going to find a few parts that will make you confused, sad, angry, all of the above. The biblical story is not a sanitized fairy tale, nor is it just trying to tell you something. It's brutally honest. It's a story of a redeeming God set right in the middle of chaos and tragedy, and you see both elements. I mean, life just happens to the real people in this story, and it really makes a difference. For me, this is a moment that provides great hope and encouragement, because when things go awry in my life, when chaos enters my life, when things are not as I planned them, what I know from the stories of the Bible, from stories like Ruth and Tamar and Bathsheba and all these stories, is that God is right there in the midst of my chaos and is at work behind the scenes. We'll talk more about that at the end of our study today. So interpret it as you will, but do not accuse the Bible of any kind of dishonesty, because it certainly isn't that. So the question we need to ask ourselves really is, what do you do when you get to the part of the Bible you don't like? What do you do when you want to just grimace and turn away? It's not me who's asking a question, it's Ruth. I mean, just look at the themes of these two stories. There are certain themes in the stories of Ruth and Tamar. In both stories, an Israelite man moves his family to Moab. That's the first verse of both the Ruth story and Tamar story. In both stories, two sons marry Moabite women. In both stories, two sons die. In both stories, the daughter-in-law goes back to Israel, to the family and the household. And in both stories, the daughter-in-law ends up with no one left to marry. So, if you're an ancient Israelite who has memorized these stories since the beginning of your life, where do you think your mind drifts when you read the story of Ruth? And just in case you somehow missed all of that, the author ties it all together, as we'll discover in chapter 4, when Ruth does in fact marry Boaz, and someone says to her, "May your household be like the household of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah." The author wants us to know, the storyteller wants us to be clear that these two stories are linked together. These two look-away moments are a part of the larger biblical story that are blended together to tell us God's great story of redemption. So we jump into the future with the story of David and Bathsheba, and we travel back in the past with the story of Judah and Tamar. These are two well-known biblical moments where a powerless woman was taken advantage of by a man with power over her. It's important to kind of check in with yourself at this point, and you may want to pause the video and just ask yourself, how are you doing? Are you completely confused at the point of the story? You had no idea that this little story was such a big deal. I mean, people often struggle with the story of Ruth in the Bible because in the story, God really isn't an actor in any way if you read just the words. But if you really read the story, you begin to discover how God is active all throughout the story. I want to check with you for just a moment because I know I've given you a lot of information in this study. But it's essential that you keep in mind that because of what happens to Ruth and Boaz only makes real sense to us if we understand where it was in the previous story. So that leads us to the rest of our story. Let's go back to reading. Boaz ate and drank, and he was in a good mood. He went over down by the edge of a grain pile. He's falling asleep on a grain pile in a barn after a night celebrating the barley harvest. His guard is down, and Ruth quietly approaches him, uncovers his legs, and lays down. During the middle of the night, the man shuddered and turned over, and there was a woman lying at his feet. "Who are you?" he asked. She replied, "I'm Ruth, your servant. Spread out your robe over your servant because you are a redeemer." Well, what does that mean, spread your robe over your servant? Some translations, probably more accurate to the Hebrew, translated, spread the corner of your garment over me. Well, back in chapter 2, when Boaz first saw Ruth across the field and she caught his eye, he noticed her for the first time. At their first interaction, Boaz says a prayer over Ruth, reminding her that her faithfulness to her mother-in-law has been impactful and important for this story. And she says, may the Lord, may you receive a rich blessing from the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to seek refuge. So then in chapter 3, Ruth says to Boaz, spread your robe over your servant because you are a redeemer. Ruth is really asking here for Boaz to be the answer to the prayer that he has prayed for her earlier in the story. A love story has been developing between Ruth and Boaz, and now in the kind of climactic scene of our story, Ruth offers herself to Boaz, although it's not really a sexual offer. It's a spiritual one. She's saying, take me, take my family as yours, call us your own, protect us, provide for us, redeem us. But it's interesting what Boaz says in response to that. He says, may you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. You have acted even more faithfully than you did at first. You haven't gone for the rich or poor young men. And now, my daughter, don't be afraid. I'll do everything you are asking. Indeed, my people, all who are at the gate, know you as a woman of worth. Now, although it's certainly true that I am a redeemer, there's another redeemer. We'll get into that guy next session. And if he doesn't want to redeem you, then I will certainly do that. I myself will redeem you. Now lie down until morning. Boaz is is taken with Ruth's request. Why? Because Ruth is a young, attractive woman, and he's pointing out that she's not running after the younger men, whether rich or poor. Boaz is flattered. While the Bible doesn't specifically tell us their ages, rabbinic tradition and commentary suggest that Boaz was about 80 at the time of the story, and Ruth was about 40 when they married. So there's a little bit of age difference there, and it flatters Boaz that this younger woman is not chasing someone her own age, but is out after him because of who he is and how important it is. She's not flirting with younger, more eligible men. She's really just talking to Boaz. You have acted, when he says you have acted even more faithfully than you did at first, he's really talking about Naomi. And what he's doing is he's giving Ruth some agency. He's saying, you're asking me to redeem your mother-in-law, but you're the one who's redeeming her. Your faithfulness, your actions are redeeming her. Now, women at that age couldn't do that. They didn't have any agency for these kind of things. And so for Boaz to make this statement about Ruth is really an important part of understanding who he was and what kind of a man this guy Boaz was. Here's the main point, though. We have two people attracted to each other, falling in love, and they're all alone in a grain pile in the middle of the night with no one else around. The barley harvest has come in, they've had a party, and they've had a little bit to eat and drink, and love is in the air. Whatever happens now, no one will be the wiser. And they essentially decide that they're going to get married right there on that grain pile. So a little bit of physical intimacy in that moment would have been tempting for sure and justifiable in 1,000 ways. But in the story, it's important to note that Boaz doesn't make a move. Boaz doesn't repeat what David would do. Boaz doesn't repeat what Judah did. He honors Ruth and is belonging to God and not to him. So, hang on. If we look at this story would have drugged the hearer back to these two other biblical stories, Judah and Tamar, and again forward to David and Bathsheba. Two well-known biblical moments when powerless women were taken advantage of by men who had power over them. And I imagine in these moments that some of us would edit out God's story if we could. We'd ignore these moments and just move on. The story of Judah and Tamar is a story that you read, you grimace, you turn away. You read David and Bathsheba and you think, wow, it's great that God forgave David and let him keep his throne when he repented, which he clearly was genuine about. I'll give you that. But what about Bathsheba? Is she just going to live under the man who killed her husband's Ruth for the rest of her life? What about Tamar? I guess it's wonderful that God has mercifully enough to keep blessing Israel through Judah, but in spite of the kind of person he was. But what does it mean for these stories, and why are these women so important to these stories? What if the story that I'm reading keeps the family name of that guy alive? What about Tamar's name? What about her legacy? What about her redemption story? So here's the question again. What do you do when you get to a part of the Bible that you just don't like? Remember, I answered the question. Not edit, ignore, or excuse it in some other way. You stick with the story. You stick with the story. Because the Bible, contrary to popular opinion, is not a series of bite-sized, standalone stories. It's a larger one comprised of a lot of smaller stories that help us really understand what the story means for our redemption. And like an epic book or a film, that means that the author is going to occasionally drop you into little storylines that make us a little uncomfortable and don't even make sense until the end of the story. Scenes that we wouldn't have scripted if it had been up to us to write the story. We would have probably edited out that moment. But each of these scenes, every single one, brings us to the perfect ending of the story. The author of Ruth is intentionally reminding us of Tamar and looking forward to Bathsheba, not to show us kind of what happens in the worst of us, but to present a contrasting story where someone acts differently when Boaz doesn't act like Judah on top of that grain pile. And that means that Ruth doesn't have to go through what Tamar experienced. God redeems Tamar's family, and I'll explain that in a moment, even though Judah is corrupt. God is redeeming Naomi's family along with Boaz's cooperation. The same result occurs, but God's work happens through human faithfulness in one case, and despite human unfaithfulness in another. In other words, God is going to get redemption done. Now, of course, the most direct path is when people cooperate with him in his mission. But he's committed to completing it even when we don't. God is ready to do it. So that's why it's important to read our Bibles as not a collection of separate stories, but as one big story. No one more story than we could throw in there makes us uncomfortable. It's important that we read those. There's another story that we might remind ourselves of. Can anyone think of another moment in the larger biblical story when a couple who had already declared their love for each other and decided to get married could have consummated their relationship and no one would have ever found out about it, but chose to remain faithful to the story, the larger story? How about Matthew chapter 1? When Joseph woke up, he did just as an angel of God commanded and took Mary as his wife. But he didn't have sexual relations with her until she gave birth to a son. Joseph called him Jesus. I mean, they're already engaged anyway. She's pregnant already. There's no way anyone will ever find out what happens behind closed doors. So a little bit of hanky-panky. Who's going to know? A little bit of physical intimacy might have seemed tempting and justifiable in many ways. But Joseph was more like Boaz than he was like Judah. So Mary doesn't need to be like Tamar. He honors Mary as Boaz honored Ruth, who belonged to God rather than to him. See, there it is again. These stories kind of roll into each other. A grain pile in a barn is almost like a Bethlehem stable where there's no room in the inn. Wait a minute now. Bethlehem. That's where both of these stories take place. Boaz's farm was in Bethlehem. Bethlehem is the birthplace of Jesus. A coincidence? I don't think so. How significant is it that we view the Bible as a one larger story? You know, Matthew, among all the gospel writers, is a Jewish writer telling a Jewish story to the Jewish readers. He knows exactly what he's doing when he starts to weave these stories together. He would have memorized these stories like Ruth as he went through his education and training as a young man. But he is using Boaz as a lens through which we can see Joseph and Ruth as an image of Mary. He highlights the hidden faithfulness of a rural couple in a particularly difficult time in Israel's history. A lens through which God's greatest promise will be fulfilled. To raise up the seed of a woman, to push back chaos, to crush the serpent's head, to restore Eden. Remember, Naomi, her name means delight or Eden. Matthew is reminding the reader of an old story of Ruth, so we can understand the larger story of how God became one of us to redeem all of us. Remember, we've entitled this study, Gleaning God in the Everyday. Do you believe that God still works this way? Do you believe that your life, your habits, your choices matter? But what about Bathsheba and Tamar? What about all those parts of the stories that don't end like the love story of Ruth and Boaz? What about the redemption of those stories? Well, if we look back to Matthew 1, we find the genealogies of Jesus. It goes through 14 generations from Abraham to David, 14 generations from David to Jesus. And it goes through all these things. And there are men's names throughout all of this stuff. But in the middle of it, it says, Judah was the father of Perez and Zerah, whose mother was Tamar. And then later on it says, Boaz was the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth. These women, these stories of these women are vital to the story of the larger story of God's redemption. And so they are woven into the very genealogy of Jesus so we understand them. And we understand that God is doing amazing things. So can you believe that God still works through these ordinary stories. As we end today, I want to tell you a story from my life that helps me kind of where I first started to discover kind of this how this works. And as I tell this story, I want to be very clear, and I'll say it again a couple times. I do not think this is that God's involvement in any part of this story is causal. He doesn't cause any of this stuff to happen, but I do believe if you look back on the story, your story, you can find God at work all around you. My dad was born and raised outside of Boston, Massachusetts. He lived there, and he's the oldest of 4 boys to my grandparents. I only knew 2 of my uncles, though, because my dad's next youngest brother, the one just younger than him, he was out teaching him how to ride a bike one day. My grandfather was in the garage working, and my dad was out in the driveway with his younger brother teaching him how to ride a bike. And in the process of that, he took off Alan's training wheels. And Alan rode around the bike, and then one time he rode out towards the end of the driveway and was unable to stop. And he ran out in the middle of the street, and a car came by, hit Alan, killed him, and kept on going. Hit and run. My dad's younger brother was dead. I never knew him. So then my dad was raised in the Methodist church. And my dad decided that when he got older, he was going to have a chance to, he wanted to be a Methodist pastor, a preacher. And so he started talking to his preacher at his church outside of Boston. That preacher had gone to Kentucky Wesleyan College in Owensboro, Kentucky to study religion, and then went to Boston University for seminary, and then went to stayed up there and pastored churches in that area. So when my dad started talking to him, he recommended that my dad go down to Owensboro to Kentucky Wesleyan College. My dad did that. He was there. In his first year, he was a religion major. After that, he decided that because of all these events that happened with his brother, he really struggled with that and his work to be able to do that, and was not able to make that happen. And so he changed his major. In the last 3 years, he was a history and secondary education major, and he became a teacher and a school administrator for his career. Fast forward that, when I was looking at colleges, I was not going to Kentucky Wesleyan College. I was going to the Eastern Kentucky University, the party school of the state with all my buddies. That's what my plan was. My dad suggested that maybe we would go to hear a financial aid presentation at Kentucky Wesleyan College, because his old history professor was now the financial aid director, and Dr. Paris was there, and so we went down through that so my dad could see his old professor. While we were there, my dad said, "Why don't you go ahead and apply? I'll pay your application fee." And so I filled out the application to Kentucky Wesleyan College, and I took it into the admissions office, and I handed it to George. Now, George was the special teams coach for the football team. And he looked over my application and he said, "I see you play football. Would you like to play football for us?" And I said, "Yes, because this is where I'm going to college, because I wanted to be a football player. That's what I wanted to do." And so I went, and I was going to major in history and be a teacher and a football coach. That's what I thought I would do the rest of my life. So my freshman year, I was a history and secondary education major. After that, I started to deal with my call to ministry, and for the last 3 years, I was a religion major. So that means that my dad at Kentucky Wesleyan College, between my dad and I, we have all 4 years of both degrees, right? So I went to seminary, and I was ordained, and I've been pastoring churches for over 30 years now. Now, what happens here in the midst of this is that my dad, if I look on the back of my office door, the stoles that I wear on Sunday morning, I have a variety of them. And my dad bought most of them. My dad bought them because in a way it was like he was buying them. He always thought he'd buy them for himself, but it didn't work out that way for him, and so he was happy to buy them for me. And as I look back at my dad's life, I know that some of the struggles he had were all based on what he dealt with as a younger man with his brother's death. So what happens is, and then fast forward again to another generation, my son, my oldest son, goes to Kentucky Wesleyan College, and then goes to Boston University for seminary, and then goes to there. I also had to have a conversation with my dad where my son was hit by a car, but survived that accident. and the difficulty of having to deal with that, and my dad having to resurface all of that kind of stuff. It was a lot of story. Now, I do not think God caused any of that story to happen. None of that happened. But when I look back over my life and I look at those events, what I understand very clearly is that God was working in the midst of the chaos of my life. That I knew that God took the chaos of my life and began to redeem it to something else, to make something else happen. When my son was in the hospital after his accident, a preacher friend of mine came to visit, and he stood there in the room and talked to me, and he goes, "You won't understand this now, and you probably don't want to hear this, but this will make you a better preacher." And he's right. I hated him for it. I was mad at him because he said that. But when I look back on it now, he's right, because it caused me to see how God was at work in so many ways in my life. How God was redeeming the larger story of my life through even little stories that seemed tragic, where I wanted to grimace, look away, and if I could just change the channel, it would have been great. I don't think God caused any of that to happen. Please hear me say that again. But I do believe that in the midst of the chaos of life, that God works redemptively to be able to bring about a larger story of God working in the world around us. That's what the story of Ruth brings about to me. It reminds me of just the power of God as a redeeming God who works in the stories of everyday people, where I might glean God in the everyday of my life. I hope as you tell yourself your story, you find ways in which you look back and you can see where God was at work in the midst of that. That's the beauty of the story of Ruth. That's the beauty of the story of faithful people throughout the history of the church. And I'm thankful for the opportunity to explore the story of Ruth together and how God can be seen in the everyday part of our life. We'll see you for one more session, session number 5. We'll wrap up the story of Ruth and see how this love story takes shape and finishes up.